You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Well, friends, we have officially made it to the end of Ecclesiastes. Today will be the last episode in our series, and I kind of can't believe it. It's been a while. We have taken several months to go quite literally verse by verse through the 12 chapters of this book. And it is the longest series that we have done on the podcast so far. It's also the first time we have made it through an entire book of the Bible on the podcast. We like to dive in head first to the most difficult parts of the Bible, apparently, because there aren't too many people out there that do a podcast series on Ecclesiastes in their first year of the podcast. But I guess if we can make it through that and have you all not hating the book at very least and hopefully enjoying it by now, then I think that means we can get through just about any part of the Bible. This week, we have the last 6 verses of Ecclesiastes, and we have finished Qoheleth's part of the book, but the book itself is not yet complete because we have a little bit of a post-credit scene here, an addendum added on by the Frame Narrator that we met back in chapter 1. And this is a super controversial part of the book because it has been used for hundreds upon hundreds of years to neuter or ignore Qoheleth's more controversial statements throughout the book. Well, at best anyway. Some people have even used these verses to completely reject the entirety of what Qoheleth has said and to suggest that the book is only to be used as a negative example of what life without God is like. Now, if you've been listening to our series so far, hopefully you realize that is not necessarily the case of what's going on here. So let's take some time and address these last 6 verses of Ecclesiastes 12, Uncut and Unfiltered. Verse 9 begins, "And moreover, because Qoheleth was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. Indeed, he gave good heed and sought out and set in order many proverbs. The preacher sought to find out acceptable words, and that which was written was upright, even words of truth. The words of the wise are goads, and as nails fastened by the masters of assemblies, which are given from one shepherd. And further, by these, my son, be admonished. Of making of many books there is no end, and much study is weariness of the flesh. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil." Just from reading that, you can probably see why these verses have been used to go against what Qoheleth has said throughout the book as a whole. But if you've been listening to our series, hopefully you realize that it's not necessarily the case. Qoheleth isn't really as unorthodox as many present him to be, and in a lot of ways, the rest of the Bible's wisdom literature isn't necessarily as orthodox as many present it to be. So I'm going to tip my hand up front here and just let you know, I do not see these verses in any way looking down upon or reversing or trying to cut back on the sting of what Qoheleth has said here. I don't think that this is an orthodox writer trying to bring Qoheleth's heresy into the realm of orthodoxy. No, we're going to see that these words are actually high praise for the wisdom that Qoheleth has shared with us throughout these 12 chapters, and that they just tie everything together in a nice bow rather than speaking against what has already been said. You can go back to our first couple episodes where we talked about the different voices in Ecclesiastes to learn more about this Frame Narrator. That is the name that scholars tend to give to the person who speaks at the beginning and the end of the book of Ecclesiastes. It's also possible that he pipes up a time or two in between the chapters, and that's stuff that we've brought up when we've addressed those particular chapters. We do not know the identity of this person, and we don't really need to. They just serve the purpose of introducing Qoheleth when he first comes on the stage, and then summing up everything that he says now here at the end. I think I mentioned this last week or the week before, but some people have suggested multiple frame narrators here, where they think that there was originally just Qoheleth's ending that stopped at verse 8, and then someone who stepped in here for verses 9 through 11, and then someone else who wrote verses 12 through 14. And the reasons for that are because they have that word further or moreover there. It's the Hebrew word yoter. It's actually related to a word that we've talked about throughout this study, Yitron, the prophet, the remainder, what you have at the end of your life, a balance in the books of your life, so to speak. It's related to that word. So it means the rest, the remainder, something left over. It's basically a way of saying, here's some final notes. In conclusion, in addition to everything that has been said, and it shows up at the beginning of verses 9 and 12. Just because it's used twice there, I don't think that means that those are necessarily two separate endings tacked on. I think it's just as likely to be one person who made an addition to what Qoheleth said, and then a little bit later thought about it and said, actually, I want to add one more thing. I mean, I grew up in a Baptist church, so that was pretty common in sermons. When you think you're at the end, you're actually probably closer to the middle. We have quite a few more last points before we actually get to the end of the sermon. So it is completely possible that when Qoheleth first delivered this message, it stopped at verse 8. We don't know when verses 9 through 14 were added on, but likely later on in the editorial process. And while I don't personally believe that these verses are an antithesis to Qoheleth's pessimism throughout the book, that is the way that many scholars throughout the last couple thousand years have viewed it. There is good reason to believe that these last 6 verses are the entire reason that the book of Ecclesiastes made it into the biblical canon. There has been debate over the years, both within the Jewish community and the early Christian community, of whether or not Ecclesiastes belonged in the canon of Scripture because of its seemingly unorthodox message. And many scholars believe that it's the presence of these verses that led people to believe that there was still something of value here. Now, I see that as misguided and a misunderstanding of the book itself. I think that if people understood the message of the book as a whole more properly, they wouldn't have needed to just look at these last few verses. But I understand, most people have not spent hours upon hours doing this study that we have to understand the context of Ecclesiastes and what was actually going on. So the average person doesn't realize that Qoheleth isn't just basically the Eeyore of the Bible. Now, if you've listened to our series, hopefully you are not just the average person coming to Ecclesiastes. Honestly, if you've listened to this series, you know more about this book than the average preacher out there does, and probably even some commentators. So now let's start analyzing the words of the person analyzing Qoheleth. Begins, moreover, so in conclusion, finally, in addition to all of this, because Qoheleth was wise. Don't miss that. Right off the bat, he is acknowledging the wisdom of Qoheleth. So this should be your first sign, right within the first line of the verse, that this is not going to be speaking against Qoheleth. This is not going to be putting him down or trying to reverse what he says. The very first thing that the frame narrator says here is Qoheleth was wise. And he says he still taught the people knowledge. He gave good heed. That's a little bit of a weird way to put it in English. That kind of sounds like it's saying he paid attention, but paid attention to what? Well, it's actually the Hebrew word itzin, and it means to test or prove something, or most literally to weigh something out. Murphy, in the Word Biblical Commentary, points out how it's usually connected with the word for scales. And he says ancient versions had difficulty with it and understood it in the sense of hear or listen in this verse. But I think that the meaning of weigh actually makes sense. Qoheleth has been weighing wisdom from both his own culture, Hebrew wisdom literature, like what can be found in, say, Proverbs or Psalms or even Job, but also with the other ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature, like we've pulled out from Egypt and Canaan and several other places. So he has been assimilating all of this different wisdom and weighing it, considering it, proving it, testing it, trying to determine what is the best wisdom sayings all throughout the world. And that's where the next bit comes in. It says he sought them out. He was looking all around for the wisest way to live. And that says he set in order many proverbs. And that phrase, set in order, is used exclusively in Ecclesiastes in the Tanakh. So there's no other time in the Old Testament that word shows up. And it only shows up 3 times in Ecclesiastes. Here, in chapter 1, verse 15, and chapter 7, verse 13. In the 5 Megalot, Cohen translated this as, he made an examination of the large number of proverbial sayings which had been composed, testing their truth and worth to select those which he considered deserving of circulation. And then the Net Bible says that this verb, takan, which we have translated as set in order, actually means to make straight. And it can also mean to arrange in order. So they say this may refer to Qoheleth's activity in compiling a collection of wisdom sayings in an orderly manner, or writing wisdom sayings in a straightforward, direct manner. Let's hear from Martin Shields about this. Thus, one of Qoheleth's activities was to correct wisdom material which was in some manner corrupted. Qoheleth achieved this through listening to wisdom of others and researching the subject matter for himself. The description of this careful procedure highlights the quality of Qoheleth's work. Where Qoheleth differed in his conclusions from other sages, Qoheleth is to be believed because he has studied their material and corrected it. The importance of this observation cannot be overstated. That Qoheleth felt it necessary to correct the wisdom of other sages clearly indicates that there were problems within the wisdom movement. End quote. So we have 3 possible ways that we can read this last verb of the verse, where it says he set in order many proverbs. Since it means to make straight, one option would be to say that he put these sayings forward in a straightforward manner. So he's worded these in a very forthright, clear way. And that's possible. It's also possible to say that he arranged these in an orderly manner. He put them in a straight fashion and organized them. Also possible. Third option is that he straightened out the wisdom of his culture and other cultures. And I kind of like this option. I think this is what the Frame Narrator is going for. Not only did Qoheleth search the world for the wisest wisdom that you can possibly find, and not only did he arrange it all together, and not only did he consider these different sayings in light of each other and test them out and prove them out, he also corrected them. Now, this presents a very different portrait of the Frame Narrator's words than what you'll get from many commentators, because here he is not in any way critiquing Qoheleth. He's actually saying that Qoheleth has critiqued the prevailing wisdom of his day, and what Qoheleth has then presented is more correct than the other wisdom that you can find either from other ancient Near Eastern sources or even from other portions of Hebrew wisdom literature, perhaps even other portions of the Bible. There may even be a veiled allusion to that in the fact that the word Proverbs is the Hebrew word masal, the very word that is used of the book of Proverbs. Proverbs 1 verse 1 uses this word masal to introduce the sayings or proverbs or wisdom of Solomon. So I think it's possibly even a dig on Proverbs here to say that Qoheleth has analyzed and perhaps even corrected some of the black and white thinking of a book like Proverbs. A literal translation of this verse would be, "Here's the rest that came to pass. Qoheleth was wise. He taught the people discernment. He tested, explored, and corrected many proverbs. Qoheleth tried to find matters of joy, morally right writings, and words of truth." And one scholar named Fishbane, who has written a little bit on Ecclesiastes, saw the wording of this verse as an allusion to the endings of some other Assyrian and Babylonian works. So he thought that the wording of these couple of verses here was similar to the conclusions of other wisdom literature from the ancient Near East. Moving into verse 10, we read that he sought to find out acceptable words. And that doesn't just mean okay words, like, it's acceptable. It also doesn't necessarily mean pleasing, but most literally it would be words or matters of joy or beauty. Those would be good words for it. Now, Shields tried to contrast the idea of pleasing or joyful words with true words, and he said that Qoheleth opted for what was true instead of what was pleasing. So in other words, Shields saw this as, yes, Qoheleth sought to find pleasing words, but instead he had to present, as the end of the verse says, words of truth. But I don't think that that's a contrast that the verse is setting up. And it's not a contrast that's present throughout the book either. Yes, Qoheleth has been presenting true words, but it's been about how to get joy out of life. His whole focus has been on how to live the good life. So I don't think that we should be contrasting the start and end of this verse, saying that you either have to choose pleasing words or true words. That's a false dichotomy. Sometimes you can have pleasing words that are also true, and that has been the focus of Qoheleth's study here. Literally, the verse reads, Qoheleth tried to find matters of joy, morally right writings, and words of truth. You could also read it as Qoheleth tried to find matters of joy, and he wrote what is morally right and true. The difference gets into some nerdy manuscript variants. There are certain Hebrew and Septuagint manuscripts that have a passive verb here of what is written is upright. But then there are other manuscripts in Syriac, the Latin Vulgate, and some other Septuagint manuscripts that have an active reading of he wrote what is upright. And there's more on that Rick Brannon and Israel Loken have put in the Lexham textual notes on the Bible you can get within Logos Bible software. Now, I've read many commentators wasting time trying to determine for whom these words would be pleasing. And they argue over whether this would be pleasing words to the audience or pleasing words to Qoheleth. And many commentators seem to think that just means that the assembled words made Qoheleth himself happy. But I don't think that's the way that we have to go with it. Again, the verse literally reads, Qoheleth tried to find matters of joy. So I think pleasing words is a little bit of a misleading translation. It's literally matters of joy. That has been his whole focus through this book, is how can I find lasting happiness? So a better observation would be that Qoheleth was searching for joy, and his conclusions on it are correct, or true, or upright, as this verse says. Now, verse 11 begins with, the words of the wise are as goads. And some commentators think that this means he was part of a specific class of sages. So taking wise not as an adjective, but as a noun, a term for a collective group of sages. The words of the wise ones are as goads. The words of this class of philosophers are as goads. And that makes sense. The argument for that logic is that we already know Qoheleth is wise. We've been listening to his words, so we don't need to hear stated again that he is wise. So it makes more sense to put him in a class of philosophers here. And so now we are lumping him together with all of these different wisdom thinkers from that culture. The word goads, it's basically a cattle prod. Something like a long stick with a sharp point on the end that can be used to move livestock along in a pasture. And there's some possible wordplay going on with the word for goads and the beginning word of the verse, which is the word for, well, words or matter. The Hebrew word for word is devar, and it's a very general word. It can mean a word, a matter, an affair. A lot of Hebrew dictionaries will say thing. It's kind of the Hebrew word for thing. There's some argument over whether or not that's actually accurate, but you can get the idea that it is a very versatile word. So it's the word davar. Well, the word for goad is dibore here. So you have dabaran at the beginning of the verse and dibore here. So you can hear some similarity. In the short article, The Scepter of Wisdom, a Note on the Gold Sheath of Zengirli and Ecclesiastes 12:11, Kurt Galling used an inscription found on a sheath in an excavation of a region in modern-day Turkey to suggest that the nails referenced here should actually be translated as scepters. It's kind of a nerdy thing. I can reference it in the show notes, but it is a fascinating idea because there has been some debate over what exactly is meant by nails fastened by the masters of the assemblies. And we'll get to the masters of assemblies bit in a second. But the goads bit kind of makes sense, right? Where you're goading you forward into wisdom, into a better lifestyle. That's been Qoheleth's goal here. But nails fastened, like, what are they fastened to? It doesn't make a ton of sense. What are we fastening nails onto, and what are we doing with that? Is it just restating the idea of goad? Well, then why just say that if you've already said goad. So what's the point? So I'm intrigued by this idea that Galling had of it being a scepter. So then we have not just him shepherding you forward, but also his leading you forward, almost like a king. And in that way, he might be returning to the idea of Qoheleth as the Solomonic persona. So it's possible. I haven't seen too many people comment on it at all, so it's definitely not a guarantee, but it is an interesting idea. Now let's talk about what this Masters of the Assemblies means. I have to admit, whenever I read that, I always think of the Seinfeld episode with the song from Les Mis, the Master of the House, Keeper of the Zoo.
Master of the house, doling out the charm, ready with a handshake and an open palm, tells us all she can.
Yeah, it's a catchy song, but that's not what's going on here, and I will try to keep that out of my head as much as I can. But Masters of the Assembly is literally Lords of the Collections. That word for assemblies means collection, and it could refer to either the people who collect the sayings or to the collected sayings themselves. So this is, again, where the idea of a class of sages or a group of philosophers common in that society would come in. These people were responsible for assembling, collating all of the wisdom that they could collect. And so now the frame narrator is saying that the words of these people, it's like having all of the collected wisdom of all of the sages together, prodding you forward, but now given from one shepherd. So let's talk about this shepherd, because there has been all kinds of debate over who he is. Some think it's referring to God. I don't think that's the case here. Others think it would be Moses, Solomon, or Qoheleth himself. Shields takes it as an indefinite noun referring just to a shepherd in general, speaking just allegorically, saying that this is an analogy, just like you would have a shepherd with a goad to move his sheep forward. So that's what Qoheleth is doing here. I think that it's probably referring to Qoheleth, and ask me again in a couple years and I might give you a totally different answer. But just as I'm studying this right now, I think because of how the frame narrator is saying that the words of all of these collected sages are like goads to prod you forward, and it's like something that has been assembled by the entirety of all the wisest people out there, but it's now given from one shepherd. So I think that he is trying to describe Qoheleth's words as being far surpassing the wisdom of all of the wisest sages that were ever put together. Now again, I read that in a very positive light, but the New International Commentary on the Old Testament, which is a pretty popular commentary, sees this as a negative rather than a positive of goading you into further learning. They're focusing on the pain of being hit with a goad and saying that this is then in a negative sense. So this is coming from the idea that the frame narrator is seeing Qoheleth in a negative light and trying to correct him. They even go so far when we get to, verse 12 here, where it says, making of many books there is no end, much study is a weariness of the flesh. They even take that as a dig on Qoheleth, saying, well, the more you study this, the more you're going to be wearied and sick of reading him. I don't think that fits at all, and I'm guessing you probably don't as well. Now that we've gone through this whole study and seen how life-giving his words are, I think we can pretty confidently reject what those commentators have said about these several verses here. I prefer how Bible Project put it, where they said the author thinks the teacher is trying to poke you to a better life. That's a creative way of describing the goads. But then they go on to say you can go too far pondering out the meanings of life. And this is where we start getting into sort of the warnings of the last couple verses here. Let's look at how the Good News Bible translates this. The sayings of the wise are like the sharp sticks that shepherds use to guide sheep, and collected proverbs are as lasting as firmly driven nails. They have been given by God, the one shepherd of us all. So there you can see that they take the shepherd as being God. Brown, in the interpretation commentary, says, had the apologist, now not apologist, but epologist, the person who is writing the epilogue here, if he wanted to convey a more positive sense of directive leadership, he or she could have easily employed the gentler images of rod and staff also wielded by the shepherd. See Psalm 23, for instance. But as it stands, Ecclesiastes 12:11 acknowledges that the sage's words, consonant with much of sapiential instruction, sting. Perhaps Qoheleth's claim that in much wisdom is much vexation, and those who increase knowledge increase sorrow, looms in the background. The path of wisdom is no road paved with gold. The trek can be torturous, as Sirach, Qoheleth's noted successor, details. At first, wisdom will walk with them on tortuous paths, and will torment them by her disciples until she trusts them, and she will test them with her ordinances. And that's from the Wisdom of Sirach 4:17. So Brown goes on to say, the goads and nails, in short, are the painful verbal instructions by which the purveyors of wisdom redirect the learner on the right path, rugged as it is. I liked what he said there because it reminded me a lot of the deconstruction journey. And in many ways, that is what Ecclesiastes has been. It's a faith deconstruction journey. It is following out one's beliefs to their logical conclusions and then pressing them even further to their extremes. And what happens for a lot of people when they start to live out their faith and their beliefs to the extreme is they realize the cracks that are there and how it doesn't hold up as well as they thought it did. See, just about any belief system can hold up and make sense when you're just living it moderately. But what so many fundamentalists especially try to push for, at least the pastors and the evangelists and missionaries, they are pushing for you to live your faith out to an extreme, to be sort of a Jesus freak sort of person where you're just all in 100%. And that's honestly one of the biggest things that leads to deconstruction. There's this stereotype of people who deconstruct, they were never serious in the first place. Well, actually, they were usually the most serious people in the first place. And that's what led them to deconstruct, because they have seen the cracks once they have pushed their faith to the limits, and they realize that there are actually limits there, and that maybe we weren't supposed to go as extreme as we did. And it sounds good when you say to be extreme for God until you actually live it out and realize it's not always practical. And that's basically what Qoheleth has been doing here, is he has taken multiple different lifestyles and pushed them beyond their natural limits and seen actually all of these fall apart here. And so you end up on this tortured path of trying to figure out the best life to lead. And that's, I guess, another stereotype that you hear with people who have deconstructed is, oh, they just wanted to sin. They just wanted an easy life. Well, I've known many people who have been on deconstruction journey, and not one of them has expressed the ease of that transition. If anything, it's always the other way around. There's always so much agonizing and guilt and shame and frustration and worry that goes with it because of the way that they had been taught. Deconstruction is not an easy choice. It's not a decision to sin. It's not even something that you normally choose. It's something that happens to you. Some have deconstruction thrust upon them. Path is certainly not easy, but it's a necessary one in order to find true wisdom and true fulfillment in life. And that's really what Qoheleth has been doing this whole time. Ecclesiastes is a book of deconstruction. It's a book of realizing that life as you know it is not as fulfilling as you thought it would be. And then it's trying to figure out, what's my purpose? What am I able to get out of this if there is nothing lasting? If I can't hold on to a moment, if I can't hold on to joy, if I can't control whether I'm going to feel happy or sad tomorrow, if I can't control whether I'm going to have all of my possessions tomorrow or lose them all tomorrow, if I can't even control whether I'm going to wake up tomorrow or not, then what am I supposed to do? What is the point of life? Well, what can I even get out of this? And as disconcerting and discombobulating as that is, I think Qoheleth has offered us one of the most hopeful responses to look for in a deconstruction process. And it goes back to that fourfold path of joy that he has talked about all throughout this book. And it's that you enjoy good food, good drinks, with good friends and family, and try to have a job that doesn't suck. So many of us Christians, particularly in fundamentalist circles, had these delusions of grandeur where every little detail of our lives was about changing the world and reaching all of the lost around us for Jesus, and all of these grandiose things that we thought that we could do. And Qoheleth is saying, why are you focused on such big things? The world is messed up. It's not the black and white of Proverbs, and it's not going to change. But you can. And maybe your little circle of friends can. And maybe over time that will change the world. But we don't need to have these grand, massive scale plans for our lives where we conquer the world for Jesus. We just need to enjoy the life that we have here, and that is pleasing to God. And in a lot of ways, that is a better testimony than shoving a gospel tract at someone that doesn't want it. People are looking for happiness. People are looking for joy. People are looking for security. And if you're someone who has learned how to enjoy this hevel life that we have, then you're going to stand out. And in Christian terms, that's being a witness. That is showing people that you are enjoying this life that God has given to its fullest. That's what we all want. And if you can figure that out, as Qoheleth has, you are showing everyone around you the goodness of your God. Now, you're probably not going to hear that in a sermon today, but that is the counter-cultural, or maybe I should say counter-Christian cultural message that Qoheleth has for us. And part of the way that we can know that is true and good and wise is because it doesn't exclude people who are deconstructing, people who don't check the boxes, people who don't fit in the box, people who don't fit the black and white binary of your thinking. Qoheleth's worldview has room for that sort of person. The sort of person who would probably be listening to this podcast. The sort of person who is maybe just like you. And so take heart in knowing that even if you don't quite fit within the box of your church or Christianity that you've known in your life, there is still room for you within a biblical worldview. It might not look like what you've seen, but it's right here in Ecclesiastes. Verse 12 was a popular verse to take out of context in college. Making of many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. But as much as that is fun to quote to a professor after being assigned too much work over the weekend, that's not actually what the Frame Narrator is saying here. Shields suggested that we should read these verses as an emphatic warning, beware of making books excessively, rather than as a mere observation about the activities of the sages. He commented that it unambiguously presents a negative assessment of the tasks the sages undertook. Furthermore, it is apparent that the tasks described here, making books and study, must refer to the activities of sages, for they have been the focus of the epilogue from its beginning. To suggest a more general application, as many modern students would feel is appropriate, divorces this text from its context. Is it reasonable to conclude that the apologist felt that Qoheleth's efforts, along with other sages, should prompt this warning? It appears likely that Qoheleth's words have been recorded, at least in part, to bear out this warning. Qoheleth's overriding conclusion was that all is hevel. For every task he set out to understand, he always wound up reaching the same conclusion. In the end, Qoheleth has proven the point. There was no end, no goal, only hevel. The task of the sages is an empty and futile task, because the answers they seek are not available to them. The apologist's earlier exhortation of Qoheleth as preeminent among the sages only serves to demonstrate that where other sages may have claimed to have found an end in their quest, they were mistaken, and so were in need of the correction which the apologist stated that Qoheleth provided. Qoheleth, the greater sage, had spoken honestly and made clear that there was no end. Now, Shields goes on and ultimately sees this as a critique of the wisdom movement as a whole. I also found some suggesting that you can read this as there is no end to buying books, not just of making of books, but of buying of books. I'm not sure how accurate that would have been for the ancient Near Eastern culture, because not too many people would have been able to buy scrolls. That would have been the privilege of the very, very wealthy, and even if you had them, you might not necessarily be able to read them. But it's definitely a sentiment that I can relate to, and Jana would probably hop right on here and agree that you don't want to take me anywhere that you can buy cheap books, because I'm going to be walking away with far too many of them, and the stack that I have of books to read is far more than I could read in several lifetimes. But what is the point of this verse? What is the point of saying that there is no end to writing books and much study wearies you? Well, we can't take this to be a reversal of the book as a whole, a way to ignore what was intended throughout this entire book. There are two main ways that people read this. One is either as sarcasm or as praise. And the sarcastic reading is what you'll find with most commentators and preachers, where they'll be saying that this frame narrator is saying that Qoheleth wearies you with all of this. And if this is as wise as it gets, and I mean, how confusing and depressing is it to read Ecclesiastes? Well, then, it doesn't get better than that. You can't add anything new to the wisdom that has already existed. There's nothing new under the sun. You can't come up with any new wise thing to say. You might be able to repackage it in a little bit of a creative fashion that someone hasn't thought of before, but you're not coming up with any new wisdom at this point in human history. And I get why they say that, but I don't think we have to be that pessimistic. I think that this verse can actually be read as praise of Qoheleth. This sort of philosophy, this sort of desk job, is just as exhausting as manual labor. You try to sit down and think about the mysteries of the universe the way that Qoheleth has, and you're going to be exhausted, both mentally and physically. He has gone to the extremes, and in the very next verse, the frame narrator says, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. So he's saying that there is no end, but then he says, let's hear the end of the matter. So I think he's actually suggesting that Qoheleth has gotten as close to a comprehensive view of human life as anyone possibly can. So I think he is praising Qoheleth's work and saying, you're not going to do any better job at figuring out life than Qoheleth did. And notice, there's nothing here that says, don't write more books. Don't keep studying. Don't keep trying to answer life's mysteries. It's not a command against philosophy. It's a warning about the exhaustion that it brings, both mental and physical. He never says, don't be like Qoheleth. He just says, realize that if you want to be, here's what you're getting into. It is not going to be an easy life. You might end up like that poor old man that was ignored in the city, even though he had wisdom to save it from a few chapters ago. I like what Brown says here. Words can either build up or tear down, but quantity is no enhancement to their efficacy. To the contrary, the proliferation of words tends only to obfuscate clear thinking and right conduct. As conventional wisdom recognized long ago, discourse is a gift to be used only sparingly. The many schemes that plague human existence begin with increased verbiage. God made human beings straightforward, and their discourse should reflect that. And so it is with some degree of irony that the sage has chosen to express himself in frequently enigmatic and indirect ways. Yet in all fairness, Qoheleth's legacy to posterity is remarkably terse. Compared to the monolithic work of Job or the baroque complexity of Proverbs, not to mention the voluminous works of their successors, Qoheleth's wisdom is powerfully conveyed in the smallest of sapiential packages." End quote. In light of everything else Qoheleth has said in the book, I think the main takeaway from this verse is, don't study so much that you can't enjoy life. Don't agonize so much over trying to figure out the meaning of life or what is right versus wrong to do in a particular situation that you don't just go out and enjoy life. I think it kind of goes back to the discussion on just do something from a few chapters ago, that we can be so paralyzed over, is this the right decision? Is that the right decision? That we never actually make a decision. And this is kind of the same vein. Don't overanalyze so much that you don't actually just get the opportunity to enjoy life. Verse 13 can be read either as "let us hear" or "all is heard." The first implies that what is to come is the telos, the completion, the last thing to be said. The second option suggests that what has come already is the telos, and that this is merely concluding thoughts. And translations are kind of split here on which way they go. Some, like the King James, have that jussive idea of "let us hear what the conclusion of the whole matter is now," and then "fear God and keep his commandments" becomes the conclusion of the matter. But I kind of lean toward the option of "all is heard." It's a very dramatic and poetic way to bring a close to this book, saying, now all has been heard. The whole matter. Which matter? All of it. Every possible one. This has encompassed everything. And seeing as this is Jewish wisdom literature, I can't help but think it is quite purposeful that the verb here in this verse, whether it's "let us hear" or "all is heard," it's from the root Shema, from the hero Israel from Deuteronomy 6. Same word. And so I think the Frame Narrator is riffing off of that and saying that this is like the Shema of Ecclesiastes. Shema is the end of every matter, the end of everything, the end of all words. And that being said, it's also possible to read that matter or word, it's that same word davar again, whether you translate it as matter, word, thing, affair, whatever it might be. It's technically indefinite. There is not a definite article there. Now, you can read one in based on some nerdy bits of Hebrew grammar that I don't need to get into here, but I think it's a fascinating reading to have it as a final word is. So let us hear a conclusion of the whole matter, because then it leaves open the reading that there are possibly multiple conclusions that we can draw from this. There are possibly multiple final words that we can have on the meaning of life. It reminds me of our conversation with Randy and Kyle from earlier on in the series, The Pastor and Philosopher, where Kyle said that there is no singular meaning of life. There are meanings of life. So while it may not be fully what Qoheleth was going for there, I think that tiny little grammatical ambiguity leads to a world of possible interpretations here. Now, some see the use of davar, that same word for word here, as a reference to the specific collected words of Qoheleth, since he frequently used the word davar in the book. But others argue that that is far too common of a word to make that assumption just because Qoheleth has used it a lot. The word shows up a lot in the Bible. So then others think maybe it means the words of other sages. So when you have let's hear the conclusion of the whole matter, is it saying the whole matter of this book, the whole matter of everything out there, the whole matter of what sages say is the best way to live? All possible interpretations. Now here's where you really start to get people thinking that the Frame Narrator is diverging from Qoheleth, because he says something that sounds very orthodox. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. Now this is similar to what we have read in the first half of this chapter, and even the last couple chapters. So if you've been following along with us, you know that this is not entirely foreign to Qoheleth's way of thinking. And I don't think that this is foreign to the book. I don't think that this is the Frame Narrator trying to just suddenly tack on some orthodoxy to an unorthodox book. I think that we can still find this as a legitimate summary of what Qoheleth has spoken about. Brown says, in sum, fear of God connotes a reverence of the holy other that is devoid of grandiose expectations and cleansed of ulterior motives. It reflects a realistic faith at its simplest and sincerest level. So see, we have to get over the idea that fear God and keep his commandments is some orthodox statement and everything else Qoheleth has said has been unorthodox. Maybe what we need to do is reinterpret what fearing God and keeping his commandments mean. And that's why I like what Brown says about fearing God actually just meaning faith at its simplest and sincerest level, devoid of grandiose expectations and cleansed of ulterior motives. Let's hear from Shapiro here. When Qoheleth tells us to fear the God and obey the God's commandments, we must not think in rabbinic terms and imagine that Qoheleth is urging us to follow rabbinic law and custom. There were no rabbis in Qoheleth's day, and since Qoheleth makes no mention of the Hebrew Bible whatsoever, he can't be talking about any dictates found in it or foisted upon it. If all that matters is to adhere to some fixed set of prohibitions and prescriptions, the book of Ecclesiastes is irrelevant, and all Qoheleth's searching seems completely unnecessary. But the book isn't irrelevant, and the searching is necessary, because Ha-Elohim, the God, is the very source of Hevel, and the commandments Qoheleth is referring to are the practical insights he has discovered for living in Hevel with joy. God-fearers, then, are those who know they do not know, and who make no effort to grasp a fixed meaning and purpose of life. God-fearers stand in awe of the unknowability of life, and yet because they understand Hevel, they know how to navigate it. The opposite of God-fearers are fools who imagine that there is some surety to be grasped and some security to be had. Now, I just want to pause there for a second and point out that those who fear God aren't necessarily the people who go to church every week. Within Qoheleth's understanding and presentation of the fear of God, The people who fear God are the ones who know how to navigate this hevel-laden life. And it's the people who think that life has to have some greater purpose that are actually the fools and not the God-fearers. And that's, in many ways, what many religious people see. They are looking for some greater purpose, and maybe that's actually missing the point altogether. Going back to Shapiro, fools, Qoheleth tells us, live in perpetual ignorance, refusing to light a candle in the dark, insisting instead that stumbling blindly will eventually bring them to a place of eternal light. End quote. Murphy in the Word Biblical Commentary has also commented on connections to the book of Proverbs here at the end of this chapter. I like how Tim Mackey from Bible Project has put it. He said, "You can't explain the fear of the Lord by trying to define fear and the Lord any more than you can define a butterfly by defining butter and fly. The fear of the Lord is a response to God's presence. This book has been about distance from God, living in a gray world in between the black and white of something like Proverbs. This writer ends where the other wisdom writers begin, the fear of the Lord." I love how he put that, because you get a book like Proverbs that says the fear of Yahweh or the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And I heard that sort of thing all the time growing up. That was a very common memory verse in the children's programs that I had in my church when I was a kid. And I just remember so many different sermons about how you have to be so afraid of upsetting God that you don't ever want to sin. And that's what the fear of the Lord is. But you know what I never once heard someone point out is that the verse doesn't say the fear of the Lord is knowledge or wisdom. It says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. See, we've acted as if that is the end goal, is fear God and you will be wise, you will be righteous. But that's not what the verse says. It says it is the beginning of that path. And so I think it's no wonder that we have so many Christians today who are stuck in the beginning stages of their faith, and they are terrified of this God that they are told loves them, but is also one step away from zapping them into an eternity in hell for sinning one too many times. They're so afraid of what this God could do to them that even though they say he loves them, they don't actually believe that. They are far more concerned about what he's going to do in his anger than reveling in his love. And I remember sitting in on several different church meetings with church leaders in different religious settings where they complained about how so many people in their congregations were stuck in the beginning stages of their faith. I can guarantee you, every single pastor out there thinks that their congregation is full of baby Christians. I heard it from so many different pastors where they're like, the majority of our people are just stuck at the beginning stages of their faith. And that's not a great thing for a pastor to be thinking about you. And I can almost guarantee you they are actually thinking that. Now, they probably won't say that to your face, but they will say that to the other staff members and maybe the deacons in a private meeting. But you know what? That honestly says more about them than it does about their congregation. Because who's the person responsible for growing them in the faith? The pastor. And so if they're not growing, it's not entirely their fault. It's the fault of the person who's supposed to be leading them and showing them how they can grow. Maybe the reason that your congregation is stunted in their spiritual growth, pastor, is because you aren't actually teaching them the love of God. You're teaching them the fear of God. Now, fear of God isn't a bad thing. Fear of God just means you realize that there's something bigger than you in the universe, and that scares you enough to be accountable for your own actions. That's not a bad thing, but it's only the first thing. The Bible itself says it. It's right there in Proverbs 1. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. It's not the telos. It's not the end goal. It's not the last step. It's not the landing. It's the first step in the staircase. And so you wonder why you have so many baby Christians. It's because you're preaching fear to them every week. It's because you're constantly telling them about a vengeful God that's more petulant than their toddler. It's no wonder they're in the beginning stages of their faith, because who wants to move closer to a God like that? That's like telling someone to get closer to an abusive boyfriend or spouse. No one's going to want to do that. You want more mature Christians in your church? Stop preaching fear. Stop trying to scare them out of hell and start loving them into heaven. Proverbs says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and Ecclesiastes ends with the fear of the Lord. He ends where everyone else began. Ecclesiastes is in many ways a backwards book, where you begin with the conclusion in a lot of ways, and then now we've moved backwards. We've traced his experiments in life, and then we've followed out his thought patterns about it, and now we're just tying everything together. And it's only after all that we get to this idea of fearing God and keeping the commandments. So he gets you to the same place, but he's gone about it a different way. And in so doing, he's completely redefined the terms to be more helpful. Now, fear of God isn't being afraid of God, but realizing that God has set up this world in a way that doesn't always make sense to us. And we can fight against that, or we can learn to live the best life that we have in this little brief hevel of a life that we have. Now, I want you to catch the very end of this verse, where it says that this is the whole duty of man. If you are using a version like the King James that has italics for words that are added in for clarity in translation, you might notice that the word duty is italicized. That isn't actually there. Now, whenever I see that, one of the next steps that I'll take is to look at other translations and see how they translate it, because sometimes there's going to be enough variance among them that I can see, oh, this is maybe a little bit hard to understand coming over from Hebrew or Greek into English. And so when there's variance amongst the translations, that's not something that should concern us. It's something that should show us there's some complexity here and there's room for disagreement in how to translate. So looking over a few different versions, remember the King James says this is the whole duty of man. The New King James says this is man's all. The NASB says this applies to every person. Good News Bible, this is all that human beings were created for. The New Century Version, this is all people must do. Christian Standard Bible, this is for all of humanity. So you can see there's quite a variance amongst the translations here. But if we're just going literally off of what it says, it would be, this is the whole human. Because that word for man or human is Adam, the word translated as the name Adam in Genesis. So we have, this is the whole Adam, the whole Adam, the whole man. And it's not wrong to supply a word like duty or to say that this is for all of humanity. But if we just look at it literally, it says, this is the whole human. This is the whole humanity. And I see that as meaning something a little bit different. I think the commandments, it's actually a word that really means instructions. We get this idea with the commandments, that's this black and white list of thou shalt not. But the Jews had a much more nuanced idea of it, where to them it was about this is how you treat other people the best way you possibly can. So what the Frame Narrator is summing up Qoheleth's words in is basically embrace the uncertainty of life. That's the God part. That's the part we can't understand. God is the unknowable in this framework. So he is the source of this hevel in a way. So embrace the unknown and then also embrace your community. That is the whole of Ecclesiastes in just a couple of words. And it really reminds me of the way that Jesus summarized the entirety of the Torah. Love God and love people. It's a very similar message. So if you can summarize Ecclesiastes in just a few words, it would be embrace uncertainty and embrace community. Similarly, verse 14 echoes the final verses of chapter 11. Judgment is not necessarily a negative thing, and we talked about this at the end of chapter 11. We shouldn't read this as don't do anything for fear of God judging you for doing the wrong thing. You have to remember that judgment just means he's going to determine, did you live your life as well as you could? And that means that you can be judged not just for the wrong things that you did, but for the right things that you didn't do. And interestingly, the Hebrew word for secret thing there, elam, has the exact same letters as the word for eternity or age that we've mentioned before, olam. It's just slightly different vowels. So I think that's probably a purposeful play on words there. And of course, we have to note that it's no surprise this book ends with a comment about good and evil. So not only do we end right back where the book itself began, but we go all the way back to Genesis, starting this cycle all over again as we comment on both good and evil and discerning that, being able to judge that, which is what God is going to do, and that is what humans did back in the garden as well. Now, obviously not as well as God would, but it's just this hyperlink back to Genesis, and it starts the cycle of this book all over again. It invites us to reread the book again now in light of everything that we've learned. And here's a fascinating little nerdy bit that Murphy found in the writings of another scholar by the last name of Wright. And it's that these 6 verses of the epilogue, verses 9 through 14, are a deliberate addition to the book to bring the number of verses in the book up from 216, which is the numerical value of the inclusio, Hevel of Hevels, all is Hevel. So if you were to add up all the letters in verse 8, you get 216 in Hebrew gematria, where each letter stands for a particular number. They didn't originally have numbers in the Hebrew language. They used the letters to stand in for numbers. We've talked about this a little bit before on the podcast. You can go way too deep down a rabbit hole of Hebrew gematria, but there's sometimes when it can have some really unique insights. I think you can go way too far with it, but this is the sort of thing that I think is really cool. So if you were to add up all the numerical values of Hevel, Hevelim, Hekal, Hevel, Hevel of Hevels, all is Hevel, you get 216, which just so happened to be the number of verses in the book. But now, if you add these last 6 verses, you get 222. And that allows you to divide the book into 2 equal parts of 111 verses each that divides right at chapter 6, verses 9 through 10. The number 111 is important because of the numerical value of Hevel, which is 37, and that occurs 3 times in the inclusion. So 37 times 3 is, you guessed it, 111. Wright also remarks concerning that Hebrew word yoter that we talked about, that the consonantal valve at the beginning, it's the Hebrew way of adding the word and onto something. You just tack an extra letter onto the beginning of the word. That consonantal valve has a numerical value of 6. It's the 6th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So the word there can have the meaning of 6 additional, since yoter means in addition or moreover or adding to or concluding. So 6 more. A sign that the editor is aware of adding 6 additional verses. And since the numerical value of devari, or words, is 216, he argues that the editor appreciated the numerical value of the word as a title for a book of 216 verses. The appendix, chapter 12, verses 9 through 14, then, thus supplies the 6 additional verses to arrive at 222. I realized that was a little complicated, so I'll put that quote in the show notes so you can see it in front of you there. But it was a really fascinating insight that Wright found there, and I didn't see anyone else comment on it. So that's Hebrew gematria at its finest. That really helps you appreciate the master craftsmanship of this book. Like, that helps you to realize that this isn't just a bunch of wise sayings put together. This is artistically woven together by a master of literary art. And that's what I love about the Bible, is it's not just important things for life, it's not just wise sayings, it is a beautiful work of literature. Wow, we have been all over the spectrum with this study. We have covered just about every possible topic, and I would love to hear from you all. First, what did you think of Ecclesiastes when we began the study? What were your initial ideas of it compared to where we are now? Did you learn things? Have you gained a new appreciation of the book? Is it just more confusing for you than before? Does it encourage you? Do you still find it discouraging and depressing? What have you learned from it, and where do you stand on it now? And second, I would also love to hear what you thought of doing a little bit more of an extended study like this, where we were able to get through a whole book of the Bible. Granted, it was a shorter book. I don't want to do a full study on something like all of Genesis, right? We're going to be there for way too long trying to get through 40 chapters of a book that big. But there are several shorter books in the Bible that we can do extended studies on like this, and that way we can get through the entire book. If you enjoyed this, let me know. If you prefer shorter series or more topical stuff or anything like that, let me know there as well. We want to be able to address the stuff that you all find interesting. I personally have loved doing this study. I am exhausted from it. I am right now living out the truth that much study is a weariness of the flesh. I did not think that I would be this tuckered out from doing all of this study. I have spent countless hours every week just poring over the Hebrew text and obscure commentaries and all sorts of things that I have not even had to do on any other series before. And I think I mentioned when we first started this that I've wanted to do an Ecclesiastes Bible study for several years now, actually probably about 4 years. When I was working at my previous church, I had submitted an idea to do an Ecclesiastes series of sermons for Sunday nights. And that got shot down. I ended up doing a Nehemiah series, actually, which became a little bit of a fan favorite there. So I'm probably going to transition that into the podcast as well and add in some stuff I've learned since then. But that's a little bit down the road, or we're not going to do that in the next few months. But I'm kind of glad I didn't get the opportunity to do Ecclesiastes back then, because I don't think I would have had the same perspective on it that I've been able to have now. It's so easy to take a wrong turn with this book, and so many commentaries and sermons have where they present it in a very negative light. And I don't think that's the purpose of it. I think there's so much life and light that we can get out of this. You know, Brown called Ecclesiastes an obituary of life itself. And in a way, it is. But in another way, once life has died, you are able to experience life to the fullest. This is what we talked about, I think, last week, where we said that the Christian idea of life through death, and what is that if not resurrection, is rooted in this very ancient Hebrew idea that you have to find death. You have to live in death before you can actually live in life. Qoheleth understands that sometimes you just had a bad day and need to take one down and sing a sad song to turn it around. But he also knows that sometimes life doesn't turn around that quickly, and you actually need to be able to sit with that darkness to appreciate the light. The darkness doesn't always go away right away. Sometimes we have to be able to learn to sit in that and appreciate even the darker moments, so that we don't go through a good portion of our lives just trying to find the next high. Most of life isn't made up of great moments. That's why great moments are great, because we don't always have them. And so if you're just constantly chasing the next high, you're going to miss out on a good bit of life. I think that's been a big part of Ecclesiastes, is getting you to appreciate what is in front of you, whether it's what you wanted or not. And Brown continues saying that Ecclesiastes is not so much a tomb as a hospice in which the dying teach the living. Surrounded by vanity on all sides, the sage nevertheless offers the key to life. In a cosmos devoid of telos, and a world filled with toil and frustration, lies yet the triumph of living in the glory of the ordinary. In The Disappointment of Expectation and Ecclesiastes 7:1-14, Tim Dooley described Qoheleth not as a glass is half full or a glass is half empty type of person, but rather as a person who realizes that either way you look at it, you have half a glass of water and half a glass of air. And then what you do with that is up to you. And I've thought for a while now about how I wanted to end this series, because it's just so monumental in the scope of what we've talked about. I feel like just about anything I can say either isn't going to hold a candle to what we've talked about, or is just going to be a poor summary. So what I settled on is a little bit of an extended quote here from Brown's interpretation commentary on Ecclesiastes. He does just as well and honestly better of a job than I could do in trying to summarize and bring this all to a close. So before we get into that, I just want to give you a quick heads up that we're going to take a couple weeks off after this. Just give me a chance to regroup. I have to catch up on putting some notes up on the website. I usually try to do that the week after an episode, and I fell behind a little bit, so I need to get that done. I need to do some prep work for our upcoming episodes for the rest of the year, and I also just need to take a little bit of a break so I can recharge and be back at my fullest for when we come back with those other episodes. So don't expect any more new episodes in August. We'll be picking up in the beginning of September, and we will still have shorts going out each week on our socials, so be sure to check that out. We'll still have our normal weekly content there. We just won't be doing new episodes for a couple weeks, so it'll give you a chance to maybe get caught up on some and take a breather as well. But we'll be back before too long with some awesome new content. Fair enough? All right. Once again, just want to say a big thank you for coming along on this adventure with us. I have loved it. I hope you have as well. Be sure to let us know what you've thought about it. Comment, rate, and review the podcast. It really helps to get it out to new people. And what helps most is word of mouth, sharing it with friends and family and people that you think would benefit from it if you have yourself. Okay, let's hear from Brown as we wrap up Ecclesiastes. A student recently told me about a friend of hers who had just finished reading Ecclesiastes and remarked that the book makes everything okay. There may be more truth to that response than all the commentaries and scholarly studies put together. To the untrained eye, how can a book so laden with the oppressive weight of weariness and so filled with the stench of death offer a word of consolation or even something redemptive? One can only imagine. Well, perhaps because Qoheleth begins with mundane experience and crafts a way of life that acknowledges in full both the dread and the delight of it all. Perhaps because Qoheleth can make the move from misery to mystery without falling into the pit of despair. Maybe because Qoheleth, for all his self-acclaimed acuity and accomplishments, turns out to be a humble searcher for truth and dignity, a casualty of his ambitions, yet a recipient of life's ordinary gifts. Or perhaps because the words of this consummate sage resonate with us all, believer and skeptic, optimist and pessimist, realist and idealist, with his unflinching view of life in all its absurdity and obscurity, and show us a way to come to terms, which is no easy feat. With anguished tears, Qoheleth has baptized the irrational world of experience. For those who hold out against the empirical odds for something greater, for some redemptive good that lies beyond the vain world as we know it, the sage reminds us that there is plenty already under our noses. Ecclesiastes recounts the journey of an ancient sage who returns not only empty-handed in his ambitious quest to figure out life, but also open-handed to the God of the simple gifts. Today's trouble is enough for today, Jesus concludes, and so also is today's gift, the sage confirms. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.